How you doing? I am David Long. Some of you guys have seen me talking on the internet about philosophy, or maybe you've been to my YouTube page and you've watched some of my philosophy videos, but I just wanted to get on here with you guys quick today and talk to you about something I've been thinking about lately, do a little bit of a rant at you, and share some ideas. I was actually originally going to try to write some of this in response to something that somebody had written to me, but instead of doing that, I decided that I would just make a video because I actually think this topic is really, really important, and that in general, there's lots and lots and lots of misunderstanding around this topic. So today, basically what I want to talk to you about is the importance of philosophy. Maybe a good place to start is like, what is philosophy? I don't think that to be a philosopher, you have to get a degree in philosophy, or that you have to have like written a philosophy book or be an ancient Greek or something like that. I think that in a very broad sense, philosophy is defined as philosophia, or to be a lover of wisdom. A person who is a philosopher is concerned with trying to understand what is actually true, what is actually good, and what is beautiful. These are basic questions of everyday life. Everybody is grappling with these questions in their everyday life to some extent. Figuring out what's true, super important and fundamental. Like the foundation on which everything rests is figuring out what's true. And further, figuring out what's good. This determines how we live in the world. So these are very, very important topics. A lot of people think that philosophy is just people's opinions, or maybe it's just a fun hobby, or maybe it's a topic that you can study in academia. I will tell you why it's not an opinion, why it's not just opinions, and I'll tell you also why academia isn't actually even doing philosophy. So let's start with that. If you go to school to study philosophy in academia, they don't teach you the best, most up-to-date philosophy. What they teach you is the history of philosophy. They put a bunch of ideas on the table for you and then kind of just let you take what you want from them. It's more of like just an introduction to the topic. That's one of the major problems with academia, is that they also kind of have this idea that philosophy is just an opinion. But it's actually not really true. Philosophy invented logic and science to arrive at better, more true ideas. Science is the testing grounds of philosophy. You cannot do science without philosophy. Science gathers data, and philosophers interpret that data. That's a really important thing to understand. So this isn't just opinions. This is, how do you sort and understand data? How do you find out what a fact or what a truth is? How do you understand it and apply it? That's philosophy. So that's not just opinions. There are more and less correct answers. There are right and wrong answers to what is true. It's not just an opinion. So it's very practical, it's very important, and it's crucial for human life to be able to be good at this. This isn't like just an option or a hobby. If you're not good at philosophy, it's going to be very, very hard for you to even be a good person. Let me try to explain why that is. Going back to this idea of truth and goodness. First and foremost, having a way of understanding what's true, what's actually true, is going to be one of the most important things that you can understand as a person, is like understanding what's happening in the world around you and how you can know. So this idea that philosophy is just an opinion was said to me by a person who was also saying something like, they only trust things that they've experienced personally. And they had this idea that if they don't know it in their own personal experience, then they don't really know it, they can't really trust it. So I would say that's a bad philosophy, and it's not even a good understanding of how things actually work. When it comes to the different types of data that you can get in terms of knowing what's actually true, personal experience is the least reliable type of data that you can have. Now, you could say that it's foundational. Personal experience is the ground floor of being able to do epistemology, which is part of what Aristotle called first philosophy, which has to do with knowing what's actually true. This is what we're talking about, epistemology. It's a topic or a subject in philosophy. So the least reliable thing is just our experience. For example, if you put a person in a room watching a thing happen, and you put a camera in the room watching a thing happen, the camera is more reliable than the person in being able to show you what happened without problems of bias or interpretation or bad memory, all these kinds of things. Like, the reason that we developed science in the first place as a methodology was because we already knew from the world that we lived in pre-science that personal interpretation or personal experience is incredibly untrustworthy. And that's because we always experience anything that happens with the concepts that we have in our mind to work with. So, for example, people talk about sometimes that any high version of technology would seem like magic to someone from the past. And why is that? As well, it's because they don't understand what it is. It's because their interpretive framework is limited so much that they don't have really the capacity to understand what you're showing them. And so the only kind of way that they have to interpret what's happening is, oh, that's magic. We also see this in religion, right? Every single religion relies on personal spiritual experiences for people to think that they know what's actually true and what's happening. Almost every religious practitioner thinks that their personal experience is somehow proof of the religion itself. Be that, oh, well, I feel at peace, and so, this must be true. Or I had an amazing spiritual experience, and so that must mean the religion is true. No, because every tradition, every religious practitioner has comparable experiences, and they all come to different conclusions because they all interpret those experiences through the lens of their religious tradition. So that's basically just circular reasoning. This is what's talked about in integral philosophy in what's called the Wilbur-Combs matrix. The idea is that there are stages of cognitive development, and then there are states of consciousness. And the idea is that states are free and stages are earned. So to develop up through stages of cognitive development, you have to do work to expand your mental framework. But at any point, at any stage of human development, you can find yourself in a type of state, but you will always interpret that state at the level of cognitive development that you're at. So I hope this makes sense. So philosophy is not just an opinion. Philosophy is a methodology of interpretation and application. It's not just data and it's true or false. It's a meta-theory about the data. And philosophy isn't just a meta-theory, but there are meta-theories to that meta-theory. So, for example, this is another problem with academia. They throw you in this soup of all of these philosophical ideas. Well, here's an idea about what's true. Here's some ideas about what's good. And then they just let you take what you want. Well, actually, if you want to do philosophy well, you have to do the projects in the correct order, or you'll end up prioritizing the wrong philosophical project, and it will mess up your interpretation of the other philosophical projects. For example, as I said, trying to understand what's true is the foundation on which all the other philosophical projects rest. This is why Aristotle called metaphysics first philosophy. Metaphysics in the context of philosophy is epistemology, ontology, cosmology, which means epistemology. How do you know what's true? Ontology is, what is it? What are the things that we're talking about? What are the categories of things? And then cosmology is, how did it get here? What's the origin of the thing? So these few topics are like the ground on which philosophy is built. So first things first, we want to have a good methodology of being able to understand what's true. So philosophy starts by using epistemology, using our personal experience, and then developing the tools of logic and science on top of that. Science, for example, of course, it starts with people's experiences, but it doesn't just stop there. It tests those experiences. It tries to falsify them. It tries to prove them wrong to see if they stand up. And it tries to construct a non-bias situation to really test these ideas. And then furthermore, there is a peer review process to make sure that we're not just trusting our own opinion, but this is true across the board. And the fact that science works, the fact that I can do a test and arrive at a conclusion over here, and you can do the same test and arrive at the same conclusion over there, and that anybody who does this test anywhere will arrive at the same conclusion, well, this tells us something about the nature of reality and how that works. And so that expands further, and then we can start to in relation with epistemology and ontology, further develop our cosmology and then test that. And then you can actually start to get a pretty solid and reliable worldview. This is the birth of modernism and science and rationality and all that. That's like what a lot of people consider to be the beginning of philosophy history, with people like Socrates and Aristotle and some of these other early Greek philosophers. But it goes much further than that into postmodern philosophy and post-postmodern philosophy. And those are all important steps in contextualizing even this original project. But it's only once we understand what's happening in the world that we can do the further projects of like morality, and further on top of that of like talking about politics, right? So some people make the mistake of starting with assumptions about cosmology, which is like 3 steps up on the ladder, and then reframing epistemology, or the idea of like looking for truth, in relation to assumptions that they've already made about the world that we live in. And the problem is that they haven't critically justified those assumptions. They haven't built up to them in the proper way. And so in starting at that point, they end up negating a foundation because the thing that they believe in isn't on a solid foundation in the first place, and then they end up jumping to conclusions, and basically they've prioritized a belief in a particular cosmology over all the other philosophical projects. Now, in order to really have a healthy philosophy, you have to honor and respect all the different philosophical projects, and they need to all harmonize and resonate with each other, so that way you have a clear and coherent worldview, a good philosophy. And this isn't just about opinions. This is about trying to figure out what actually is really happening and how we can prove that. Now, once these foundational projects are doing good and in place, then, of course, it's important to have a good moral philosophy. If you're not taking into account these moral distinctions, which most people aren't, let's be real. What most people are doing is they're floating through life, doing whatever it is they feel like they want to do, and in kind of in an impulsive way, right? And then they tell stories to justify their behavior after the fact. So they have post hoc justifications for their impulsive behavior. They don't have clear standards for their actions that they hold themselves to with integrity. So these two things, a filter on the front end of like, how do I know what's true? And a filter going out in terms of how do I regulate my behavior? If you don't have a good epistemology and a good morality, it's almost impossible to be a good person. If you're a good person in that context, it's probably by luck. You know, maybe you have good intentions, maybe you kind of like try to be good, and then a lot of the times maybe you do. But if you want to consistently and reliably be a good person, you need to have a rigorous set of filters on the front end to figure out what's actually true, and a rigorous set of filters on your behavior in terms of how you act in the world. This is super practical and it's super important. We live out the answers to these questions in our lives every day. And it can be the case that people often put morality as the main focus in their philosophy. And that can be a problem too. I mean, I do think that achieving the good is maybe more important than understanding the true. But in order to be able to reliably achieve the good, you first have to understand what's true. It's like the best way to actually achieve it, because we try to be good for what is. And this is why a lot of religious people, they think that they're being good, but because their worldview is incorrect and unfounded and unjustified, their ideas of what is good aren't actually in line with reality how it is. And so even though they're trying to be good, they're not actually good. It's a major problem. So, taking philosophy seriously, not just treating it as an opinion or a hobby, and really realizing that these are things that are very practical and important, that we live out answers to these philosophical questions every day of our life, is really important. And not only that, the projects have to all be honored and they have to harmonize with each other. Your basic idea of epistemology, the factors that you have in play, are also factors that need to be taken into account in your morality. You know, if we're taking into account subjectivity, relativity, objectivity in our epistemology, then those things also need to be reflected in our morality. The problem with most people is that they have an incredibly reductionist perspective. They are only taking into account a couple of these factors, and they end up reducing everything down to just that limited approach, and they end up leaving a lot out. And then what they're doing isn't really as good or as true as it could be if they took into account more factors. This is why philosophy is really important. It's not just some pie in the sky thing that academics talk about, or some opinion of some person. Philosophy is a crucial human topic. It's not something to overlook. You need to have a good methodology, a good epistemology to know what's true. Otherwise, you probably aren't really understanding what's true. You're not taking into account all the factors. You're not sure how to measure all the factors, and you'll end up confused. And on the moral side, if you're not taking into account multiple moral factors, your scope is really limited, and you might end up justifying some bad behavior or not living up to your full potential, or even up to your own highest standards in line with what your heart is and like what you want to do and what you want to be, because you might not be thinking about all of these important factors. A lot of people take a one-size-fits-all approach to morality. Maybe they just are concerned with intention, or maybe their philosophical approach is like the golden rule or something like that. Maybe they're a consequentialist who thinks that it's like, well, if something has good results, then it's good. If it has bad results, then it's bad. Maybe people are taking a utilitarian approach, and it's just like the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, there's expansions upon these ideas. There's the greatest depth for the greatest span. There's Aristotelian virtue ethics and this idea of the golden mean, looking at these different extremes between like being a coward and rushing in foolishly. There's like a middle position that is called courage, and that's a personal virtue, right? So if you only have utilitarian ethics and you don't have Aristotelian virtue ethics, your approach to being a good person is going to be really limited. Just like if you are an empirical reductionist or a subjective reductionist or a relativistic reductionist, your understanding of truth is going to be incredibly limited. We need to expand our perspectives and take into account more factors to be a better person, to be more skillful, and this is why it's important to be a philosopher. Not just to sound smart, but to actually understand what's happening and be a good person in the world. This is a subject that should be important to every single person. It really shouldn't be something that should be thought of as a hobby or something that you can opt out of. If you're not interested in philosophy, you're not as good of a person as you could be if you actually took into account more perspectives and had a more skillful methodology and application. So, this is why I'm here to talk to you today about the importance of philosophy and the importance of doing the philosophical projects in the correct order and honoring all the different projects instead of pitting them against each other. So these are the major problems that I'm seeing with, frankly, almost everyone in the world. Most people don't have a good philosophy, and so it really limits all of our potential. So this stuff is super important, and I really, really wish that more people would take it seriously and put in the time and the effort and the work to refine their skills, to expand their perspective, to develop their own personal growth, so that way they can interpret their experiences in a much more reasonable and better way, and that they can craft their actions and their moral decisions in the world in a way that's going to be better for more and more perspectives and more beings. So, thanks for listening to me rant about this. I appreciate all of you. If you want to know more about how you can develop these different things, hit me up in terms of what projects you're interested in learning more about, or you can also check out my YouTube page, and I have some really good meta theory videos about epistemology, which talk about the different aspects of reality and how to measure them. And I have a pretty good video on primacy with my buddy Layman Pascal from the Integral Stage, and we talk about how you have to do the philosophical projects in the correct order, and that certain of the epistemic and ontological aspects of reality might be primary depending on what the different philosophical project is. I know it sounds all very complicated, and it can be complicated a little bit, but it's really important to get this stuff right. Thanks so much for listening to me rant about this topic. I hope you understand why I'm saying that it matters, and I hope you feel inspired to dig in deeper. Thanks so much for your time. Peace.